Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
This is Jane. She thinks she's just filling her car, but she's also filling the air with cancer-causing toxic chemicals used to boost octane in gas. What doesn't burn in the engine enters the air and your lungs, even your heart and brain. Bad for everyone, especially kids. Ethanol is a natural octane booster, clean burning and non-toxic. More ethanol means less scary stuff in our gas and in the air we breathe. And that makes your choice pretty plain, Jane. American Ethanol, cleaner air for Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Luke Beckman talks about harvest results in Nebraska. Mary Drewnoski explains why excess corn on the ground could be a problem for grazing livestock. Brent Gloy looks at crop production costs, and Mike Castellano outlines ways to limit nitrogen losses in corn and soybean fields. Luke Beckman from Central Valley Ag is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. The 2017 American corn harvest is past the halfway mark. The latest progress report from the U.S. Department of Agriculture shows farmers are 54% complete, although that's 18 points behind the country's 5-year average. Soybean growers are 83% finished with harvest, only a point behind their normal pace. We talked with Luke Thursday morning and began by asking for an update on progress and a look at early yield results.
Well, I think in Nebraska, we've got the soybean crop put away. Yields sounded pretty variable, just depending on where you were. There were some good things out there, and maybe some yields that disappointed. We look at the corn crop. I think we've moved past the halfway point. We're starting to see some guys start to finish up. I think you give it another week to 10 days, you're really going to capture a lot of that, at least in Nebraska.
Outside of Nebraska?
I think the harvest pace is not a concern of the market. I think we're moving along pretty methodically. You look at what the weather forecast looks like, and there's really not a lot of concerns that we're not going to get this crop taken out.
Analyze for me the recent market movements or lack thereof we've seen in corn and soybeans.
It's been quiet. I think the soybean market's been encouraging. You look at the technicals, and the soybean market's kind of bounced off an uptrend here early this week. Some key moving averages held. So I think that paints a pretty good picture in the bean market, especially when you tie the fundamentals into that and understand that China has a lot of beans to buy yet. I think that's going to give us some good commercial support in beans, especially as we get into the early stages of the South American growing season. The soybean market probably paints a good opportunity to see higher prices this winter. Corn, very sideways, very quiet. We're just awash in the feed grains basically across the globe. So nothing going on in the corn, very stagnant.
Describe the conversation you have at this point in time with your customers now that they know pretty much what they're going to have for production this year.
That's absolutely right. They've received that feedback. Yields are feedback, and they know for sure what they have. That really gives them an opportunity to figure up that final break even. We know what our costs are. We know what our production was. So what do we need out of this crop to be profitable to pay our bills? So that's really been a conversation, is what type of revenue, can you create knowing what you have for a yield? At that point, you can really start to look at, well, what price do I need to sell at? This market continues to be supply driven, and when we have a supply driven market, we have good carry built into futures prices. So if you go look at a bid sheet today, you're going to notice that there's a better price for next summer than there is, right now or even this winter. So the market is offering you an incentive to carry grain. So grain storage is going to be full, the bins are going to be full, and if you have open grain, the only way to take advantage of the incentive that's out there is to sell something. And so, if you're a producer that, maybe has 10, 20% of your crop marketed, and the rest is open, you really have an opportunity to maybe lock some margins up, but you have to step out into maybe next summer and make a sale. But if that's a profitable sale, why not do it? That's really been a lot of the conversation we've been having.
In that conversation, how do you talk about basis and how you think it will move as we close out 2017 and the 2017 harvest and move into 2018?
I think that the windstorm that we had towards the tail end of October threw a little bit of a curve in the cash grain market. We definitely lost some corn in our geography. And so what I think that does is, when there's this much carry in the market, ethanol is demand, feed is demand, and exports are demand. Well, so is space, right? So we have all this grain storage capacity on the farm and in the commercial system. Those elevators, the farm space is going to want to be full. So if we've taken a little bit of the crop away with the wind, I think you see basis stay steady to want to firm to make sure that we've filled all that space. So as we get into post-harvest, I think the market is going to have to take the incentive away from what we just talked about. And in order to do that, you're probably going to see the futures spreads start to firm or come together. And basis is going to have to do a little bit of work to start getting grain to move again.
USDA's November crop report is next week. Do you have expectations about what the agency will do?
Yeah, we are starting to see some private information come out. I think we would expect the corn yield to go up. It's gone up the last 2 months. An old adage, big crops get bigger. So we would expect the corn yield and production to go up next week. Soybeans are a little bit tougher. They've been a little harder to figure out. If you recall, a month ago, the USDA actually brought the yield down when everybody thought it would go up. So I think there's a few more question marks about the soybean market, which again is going to paint maybe a better opportunity for the bean market going forward.
Next week, Elaine Cubb will look at corn and soybean prices, and Iowa State Extension livestock economist Lee Schultz will analyze hog markets. After Senate confirmation last week and a swearing-in ceremony Monday, Greg Ibaugh is the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Undersecretary for Marketing and Regulatory Programs. The position in Washington, D.C. oversees the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, the Agricultural Marketing Service, and the Grain Inspection, Packers, and Stockyards Administration. Ibaugh operates a family farm near Sumner and previously served 12 years as the director of Nebraska's Department of Ag. Matt Haybrock, the Assistant Director of Ag under Ibaugh, is Nebraska's interim director until Governor Pete Ricketts names a permanent leader. Sustained high winds over much of Nebraska during late October may have complicated corn stock grazing. We've told you previously, University of Nebraska-Lincoln research shows the practice of allowing cattle to graze stalks can be mutually beneficial for crop and livestock producers. However, if those winds knock down too much corn before harvest, you may need to make extra preparations before turning cows or cattle into fields. Nebraska Extension's Mary Drewnoski says corn losses of up to 20 bushels an acre occurred in UNL research fields near Meade, and up to 50 bushels an acre of corn were found on the ground near Clay Center. We talked with Mary earlier this week and asked how that could cause problems for livestock.
With cattle out grazing, we have a problem with them eating too much corn and causing acidosis or lowering their ruminal pH such that you can actually kill cattle.
Well, how do you determine then how much corn is in the field?
That's a great question. The easiest way is actually to go out and walk areas of the field, and what we suggest is essentially go out in between two rows, walk 100 feet and count how many ears you find. Do that in 3 different places in the field, so you have a total of 300 feet. Take that number, so let's say I had 30 ears total, divide that by 2, and that tells me how many bushels of corn grain I have in the field. And so in this case, if I had 30, it'd be 15 bushels.
How much is too much?
How much is too much? Anything greater than 10, we have to start thinking about how do we mitigate that risk of acidosis.
Do different animals, different classes of livestock consume that differently?
Yeah, actually, mature cows who've been out in the field before, they know what this is and they go seeking it out. And so we have issues with them actually overeating and having acidosis, whereas a calf or a replacement heifer who's never been out on stocks, it takes her a while to figure this out. And so we have a lot lower risk with them. Plus, with those calves or replacement heifers, there's some value to that extra energy. They can actually gain a little bit more, and so they can make use of that. Whereas, our dry spring calving cow, really she doesn't need that extra energy, and so it's really not all that beneficial for us.
If possible, then should you change the class of livestock that you're putting on the field?
If you have the ability to utilize, let's say, some calves that you just weaned or some replacement heifers, it's probably one of your better options if you have a lot of downed ears.
Otherwise, tell me how you can safely graze.
Yeah, so unfortunately it's going to be some extra labor. I mean, there's some things we can do if we're in that 8 to 10 bushel range, like A, making sure they're full when they go out, B, adapting them to grain before. So that means start feeding about 2 weeks beforehand and bring them up onto corn. So start at about 2 pounds a day, work your way up to 10 before you turn them out. And also feeding Meninsin. So, and you can provide that in the mineral, and that will help lower the risk of overeating. However, if we're above that 10 bushels, we're probably going to have to limit access. So that means either strip grazing or providing them access to not the whole field at once. Putting a lot of cows out is a lot better than putting few cows out. One of the things I want you to think about, let's say you have 20 bushels out there, which is not common right now with all the wind. That's over half a ton of corn grain per acre. So if I had 100 cows and I gave them access to 1 acre, they'd be able to eat 11 pounds of corn per day just in that 1 acre. So really we're looking at a substantial amount of corn out in those fields.
Does anything change if you bale it? Do you need to be concerned about picking up additional ears there or anything like that?
So it's a good question. Actually, I think baling it is an opportunity in that most people, they're going to go through and bale. They will pick up some ears. There will still be some ears on the ground, but they'll pick up some of them. Most people that are going to feed that are actually going to grind it up, and so it's going to get mixed in. It'd probably provide a little additional energy, but there's very little risk of overeating.
The final question, perhaps maybe the most important, is there a price adjustment if you're going to be grazing on land like this?
That's a great question, and to me, there's pluses and minuses to this downed ear situation when it comes to grazing. The plus is, yeah, you have some added energy out there. The minus is we have a lot higher risk, and we're going to have that higher labor because we're either going to have to limit access via time or limit access by extra fencing. And so to me, I think it's really a wash.
Nebraska Extension's Crop Residue Exchange is available to producers looking to list or rent available cropland. That tool is available online at cropresidueexchange.unl.edu. You can find more information about grazing residues with livestock on UNL's beef website, or you can contact your local Nebraska Extension office for more information. At the end of this month, the USDA will update its forecast for farm income in 2017. The agency's current estimate for this year, released in August, showed a slight bounce, projecting net farm income 3% higher than in 2016. Purdue Ag economist Brent Gloy talked with us recently in Omaha about costs and returns for crop producers going into 2018. We started our interview by asking about an earlier conversation we had in January. When we interviewed Brent at the Fremont Corn Expo, he said farmers and ranchers needed to be prepared to weather this tight economic situation for at least the next 3 to 5 years. When we talked again in late September, we asked if anything about that thought had changed.
Unfortunately, no, I don't think so. I think, you know, as you look at ag cycles, they tend to have long troughs, and I think the good news, is that maybe we're at the bottom of kind of the income trough. So I think that is somewhat good news, but you know, the next few years, I think we're gonna be a time of, you know, chance to make some money every now and then, chance to lose some money every now and then, and so we're gonna have to be really good managers to kind of make it through the next 3 to 5 years, I think.
Talking about that income maybe bottoming out, and we've talked about it with Tina Barrett and David Widmar before, what keys do you see that make you say the bottom has been reached?
Well, one good thing I think that's really positive is that cost structure, particularly on corn and soybeans, has worked its way a lot lower, and that's a really positive sign. So the prices that are required for farmers to make economic profits are a lot lower. Somewhere around $4 a bushel will generate some economic profits, which just a few years ago that number was well over $4.50. So I think we've worked our cost structure lower, and I think that's one of the really positive things. The other thing is that we've been dealing with some pretty big grain stocks, and there seems to be a pretty strong demand base that we put in place. So we're able to find things to do with the big crops that we have had, and that I think is encouraging.
Tell me specifically what costs are helping farmers and if there are any that aren't doing so well right now.
The biggest cost reduction we've seen is in fertilizer prices, particularly nitrogen. And right now, nitrogen prices again look to be soft. So I think that's a really good thing for farmers. It's encouraging that we're seeing that cost reduction. On the other hand, seed prices have been pretty strong and stable. Chemical prices, I think there's maybe some softness in chemical, but this expenditures that people are putting out on chemicals has not declined because weeds are becoming just more problematic. So when we look at the variable costs and what might change, I think fertilizer is where the hope for the biggest cost savings come. And then I think that will be partly influenced by how many acres of corn go in.
So what about fixed costs?
On fixed costs, you're dealing with land and you're dealing with equipment. And we'll start with equipment. And what most farmers have done in the last couple of years is they just quit. They just quit buying equipment. And that's helped their cash flow quite a bit. The problem is that you can only do that so long. And so for a while, I used to say that farmers at the prices we're at were paying for either their land or their equipment, but not both. And I think most of them chose to pay for their land and delay equipment purchases. And we can only do that for so long. And I think you're going to start to see some of that change. People might have to spend some more money on equipment again, but it's going to be really important to do that wisely and make good investments there.
In this off-season, what do you think it would be valuable for producers to look at when they go back to their books and think about 2018?
Well, I think first thing, look at your cash flows and your financial situation. What's your liquidity levels? Where are you at? And really try and understand and assess, where you're at financially. And then look at your cost structure and see if there are things that you can do, places to cut, to kind of work through looks at this point to be another kind of tough year.
Yeah, I think this year has been a year where the conversation about people exiting the industry has been very real. Are there some warning signs or some levels where you think farmers need to say, this is a problem?
Yeah, I think, if you're having trouble with debt service, that's the biggest thing. So once it gets to a point where we're having a really hard time servicing our debt, that's a major warning sign, because even though there might be equity on the balance sheet, if we can't generate the cash flow to do it, we can borrow against that equity and refill our cash reserves, but if we just burn through them again, we're not really solving the fundamental problem. So we really have to work to get the cost structure down so that we can make the business sustainable for the long run. So cost structure is the most important thing long-term to fix. In the short term, understanding liquidity and how your debt service shapes up is really important.
We previously talked with Brent about ag land values and how farmers can analyze cash rent levels. You can find that interview in the September 29th episode of Market Journal. Iowa State University soil science professor Mike Castellano was on UNL's East Campus earlier this fall to present a seminar on nitrogen loss in corn and soybean fields. It's a topic pointed to when talking about the Gulf of Mexico's dead zone, an area where nutrient pollution from ag and developed land runoff creates an unlivable environment for aquatic life. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration said the dead zone this summer was the largest it had ever measured at more than 8,000 square miles. We talked with Mike before his presentation and began by asking why nitrogen loss is getting more attention.
A couple of years ago, a few years ago, the EPA decided we needed to reduce nitrogen loads to the Gulf of Mexico by 45%. That's a tall order. And that didn't get much attention, though, because the Gulf of Mexico is not exactly in our backyard, right? But then a couple of years later, the Des Moines Water Works, which serves nearly a third of the state's population with water in one way or another, decided to sue drainage districts over high nitrate levels because they're also home to the world's largest nitrate removal facility. And so that's really what turned the spotlight on nitrogen and water in Iowa.
Explain how nitrogen or nitrates get into the groundwater.
So oftentimes the first thing we hear is fertilizer, fertilizer, fertilizer. If you just stop applying fertilizer, everything would be all right. Or if the rates were reduced a little bit, everything would be all right. That couldn't be further from the case. So in Iowa, there's 10,000 pounds per acre of nitrogen that naturally occurs in our soils, whether we farm them or not. To put that into perspective, a farmer's applying about 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, or 1.5% of the total that's already there, in fertilizer every year. And so right there, that's one indicator that fertilizer is not the main problem or the main cause of nitrate loss to the waterways. Another good example is nitrate loss from corn and unfertilized soybeans. They're equal, if not a little bit larger from soybeans. And the reason for that, the reason for the nitrate loss, is because most of that nitrate's being lost because there's no crop growing. So if the soil's warm and wet, microbes naturally transform that 10,000 pounds of nitrogen. They'll do about 2 to 4% of that per year, or 200 to 400 pounds per year, naturally transform it into nitrate, a compound identical to fertilizer, and then if there's no crop growing to use it, we lose it.
Meaning what, you want a crop in there the entire time?
Well, that's one strategy to reduce nitrate losses downstream, and cover crops would be an example of that, right? So growing crops for longer periods of the year than corn and soybeans are growing is one way to reduce nitrate loss. That's why cover crops are a good tool. So they grow when corn and soybeans are not growing. They cover those early spring and late fall periods where the soil can be warm and wet, conditions that are conducive for the microbes to transform that organic nitrogen into nitrate. But they don't interfere with the corn and soybean crop too much. There's a whole nother set of, and we call that an in-field strategy. So that helps keep nitrogen in the fields for our future crops.
You said that was an in-field option. Are there others?
There are. So we have in-field options to reduce nitrate loss that hold the nitrogen in. Cover crops is the great example. Alfalfa might be another example because it's a perennial crop. These edge-of-field practices, these are practices that remove the nitrate after it's lost from the field, but before it goes downstream. And these practices, they can be used in tile-drained fields. So a good example of those are denitrification wetlands at the bottom of watersheds. So we take out a couple % of the acres from a watershed, take it out of production, route the tile drains into the denitrification wetland, and they can be extremely effective at removing nitrate.
Can we have all of this? Can we have soil health? Can we have yield? Can we have water quality? And I think to add in here with some of these, economic feasibility as well.
Yeah, can we have it all? Can we make money, have great water quality, produce a lot of corn and soybeans? And I think we can do it. It's all about targeting the right practice for the right place. And when I say the right practice, I'm talking about nutrient loss reduction practices. So we know we're great at growing corn and soybeans. Where we need to improve is reducing nutrient loss off the farm, while we continue to improve corn and soybean production, of course. But the real challenge for the future is targeting specific practices to the right place. So where are cover crops most effective? Where are they most economical? Where is the denitrification wetland the most effective and the most economical? That's the future.
Do you think these things can happen without some sort of government regulation?
I think they can happen without government regulation, but not without government assistance. So, this is coming from Iowa, for example, the reason why we have such a great economy in Iowa is agriculture is the backbone of it. And I don't see that changing in the future. So I'd hope everybody would be willing to pitch in and make some of these changes.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. And during this last week, we've seen an oscillation of temperatures almost on a daily basis as we had one system after another following this footpath of the previous system. Most of the snow that we've seen this week occurred either on the day Tuesday, Thursday, or yesterday. And the most widespread precipitation event was on Tuesday, which didn't amount to much, but we did have an extended period of snowfall. It was nice to see the flakes for the first time of the year for many locations east of the Panhandle. But more importantly, we did see some exceptionally cold air following that system, and with the warm ground temperatures, we didn't expect to see any accumulation out of this system, but we actually did see some light accumulations, less than a quarter inch across portions of central and south central Nebraska. Now, as we go through this weekend, at least we've got some warm temperatures to work with, at least for the most part of this weekend, before we turn our attention to a series of waves that'll be moving through the region, possibly bringing us some cooler conditions as we get later into the week. So as we go to the upper air models, here's the big trough in the western United States, southwest flow aloft, bringing in some mid-level moisture into the region. Unfortunately, we don't have a deep fetch of moisture from the Gulf as the surface low is basically across northwestern Kansas, southwestern Nebraska. So any of that moisture that comes up is going to be pulled way north of us, and most of the precipitation over the central Rockies and the Dakotas. Then as we go into tomorrow, The trough comes a little bit closer. We've still got a southwest flow loss, so we're going to see some fairly warm temperatures back up in the 60s. Low pressure over the southern United States, several of them from the southwest to Texas. But again, there's really no moisture fetched to the north, so most of the moisture are associated in the central Rockies and the Pacific Northwest. And then on Monday, this trough starts to make its way toward the Great Lakes. So we're showing a series of low pressure systems at the surface, but once again, with that southwest flow aloft, not a lot of moisture is going to make it up into the central plains. Most of it will stay into the eastern United States. It does show a touch of precipitation, particularly Monday night across the northwestern part of the state. And then we kind of go into more of a zonal flow as high pressure, cool as it is, stays to the northern plains, really pushes the jet stream a little bit farther to our south. So definitely a cooler conditions. They're showing some returns here, at least in terms of the precipitation, but I don't think it's going to happen. And on Wednesday, we kind of start seeing another trough coming in the western United States, mixed flow in the middle of the country. Surface lows, again, not a lot to work with, but with high pressure to the east, that will try to pull some moisture. And the way the jet is set up, it looks like most of it will fall to the south of us. Now, as we get into Thursday, we start to see another trough building into the western United States. Winds in the upper atmosphere come to the southwest, so we should start to see a warming trend on Thursday. Low pressure to our northwest really will not be a player, as most of the moisture will be associated with that trough coming into the western United States. And then as we get on the day Friday, really wants to move this system rather quickly toward Nebraska. I think this is overdone. I think it's going to be much slower. But if it does indeed occur, we expect to see a low pressure system by the models develop somewhere in central Kansas, and that may actually be able to pull some moisture up into the system with a more widespread precipitation event over the central Rockies. More importantly, as we go out to 8 to 14 day forecast, we can see that Nebraska is at the periphery of the cold and the warm, and in terms of precipitation, below normal precipitation, but I think that system is going to be much stronger, and I think we're going to be more in the above normal category.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, safely grazing corn residues, crop production costs, and limiting nitrogen losses. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Next week, Elaine Cubb will recap the USDA's November crop report, and Tamara Jackson-Zims will talk about using disease histories to select appropriate corn varieties. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.